Hello everyone, it's Deborah with Diva Lady Designs and I'm so happy you decided to join me today. In this video, I'm going to be showing you a fun technique using embossing powder. Usually when we heat emboss, we use it with a stamped image. But today I'm going to use it with a dry embossing folder. It creates a wonderful textured background, allowing the dry embossed image to really pop. It's a super simple technique and uses supplies you probably already have on hand. I'm always looking for new ways to use products I already have, and this technique allows me to use embossing folders and embossing powders, both of which I have plenty of, and I'll bet you have them too. So let's get to it. For today's project, I'm using a leaf embossing folder from Altenew's Craft Your Life kit, Always Sunshine. I'll also be using Altenew's Beautiful Day stamp and coordinating die set and some rose gold crisp embossing powder. You'll need a sticky ink to hold the embossing powder, and I'm using Versamark ink. And you'll also need a brayer to apply the ink to the embossing folder. Finally, my sentiment will come from Altenew's Bold Sentiments stamp set. I'll be embossing on a piece of Gina Design's Moonlit Fog cardstock, cut to 5.5 by 6 inches. To begin, open the embossing folder and find the side that has the indented image. I find that this technique works best when you're working on a raised background. Ink up your brayer and roll it over the indented side of the embossing folder. You'll want to use plenty of ink and roll it in many different directions to make sure every part of the embossing folder side is covered. It's okay if some gets on the image itself. It adds a lot of interest. Carefully place your cardstock on top of the inked side, close the folder, and run it through your die cut machine. When you open the folder, you'll see that the Versamark ink has covered the entire piece of cardstock. It actually looks darker. Now, if you didn't want to emboss, you could use this as is, but I'm going to cover the entire piece of cardstock with Altenew's Rose Gold Crisp Embossing Powder, making sure to cover every part of the cardstock. Like I said, if you get some of the ink on the raised image and embossing powder sticks to it, you can just wipe it off or leave it for added interest. Make sure your heat tool is heated up really well and emboss the cardstock. I like to keep the tool moving so that the melting powder doesn't bubble. Now, I experimented with heating from the front and back, and really there was no difference in the result, so I chose to melt it from the front. When it's done, look at that gorgeous shine. I love how some of the powder got into the nooks and crannies of the image, and some is actually on the leaves themselves. It's just so full of texture. I want to create a focal image for the front without taking away from the background, so I'm stamping a flower from Altenew's Beautiful Day stamp set in Versamark ink and embossing it in the same rose gold embossing powder. I used the coordinating die to cut it out and also cut out an additional 2 flowers from the leftover white cardstock for stacking. For my sentiment, I stamped a sentiment strip from Altenew's Bold Sentiment stamp set in permanent black dye ink and cut it out, leaving a sliver of white around each edge. I also cut a few strips of white cardstock from the leftovers to glue behind the sentiments to give it dimension. You don't have to do this, but I'm a big fan of dimension, and I find that foam dots or strips often won't hold up well in the mail. I'll cut strips of cardstock from scraps and glue them together to give a stacked look to my sentiments and images. It's totally optional, but that's just the way I roll. To assemble the card, I created a 4¼ by 5½ inch white card base and trimmed my embossed panel to 4 by 5¼ inches. After adhering the panel to the card base, I placed the white flower on the front. In the end, I decided to use some foam dots on my stacked flower so I could tuck the sentiment behind one corner. It just goes to show you that no rule is immovable. Do whatever works for you and the card you're creating. And to finish, I added some coppery sequins to the center of the flower using some liquid glue. I was blown away by the incredible texture and shine of the embossing powder. I tried this technique with several other embossing folders using different color cardstocks and whatever embossing powders I had on hand. Clear embossing powder gave a gorgeous result, but silver wasn't so great. Now, I loved the result on this card. I used a light pink cardstock with some holographic embossing powder. Look at that shine! The clear nature of the sparkly embossing powder darkened the background and let the raised image pop. I just added a foiled sentiment from my stash and some pearls, and the card was complete. I hope you'll search through your stash of embossing folders and powders and give this technique a try. It's super easy, and you won't believe the gorgeous results. Thank you so much for joining me today. I've linked all the products used on my blog, and there's a link to the complete list below. If you like this video, I'd really appreciate a thumbs up, and I'd love you to subscribe. Thank you so much for joining me today at Diva Lady Designs.